Night, everybody. Welcome back to the Yuku Podcast. Now, as always, I would like to give an acknowledgement to country. I today am on the Gadigal land of the Eora Nation, and I'm honoured to be here. I'm honoured and I'm grateful and I'm appreciative of the traditional owners of this land. Through their efforts of preservation, through their efforts of land management, we're able to enjoy some of the most beautiful sights in the country on this beautiful and sacred land. I'd also like to acknowledge the land of the traditional owners that you're tuning in on. Wherever you go in this continent, it is and always will be Aboriginal land. So with that in mind, we're going to kick off with today's topic, which is talking about World Breastfeeding Week. We're also going to be talking about white feminism. We're also going to be talking about motherhood. We're also going to be talking about the experience of colonization and the ways that it shapes even the most simplistic of topics such as breastfeeding. Now, before we begin, I think it's really important that I involve myself in this conversation. I think it's really important that when you're discussing topics such as this, it's really important that you have a connection to them. I think you can be really, objective when you're not necessarily embedded in that issue or that discourse. And I'd like to state that I did breastfeed my daughter. You don't need to breastfeed to find a value and an importance behind it. But for what we're about to yarn about today, this is a really integral aspect. So my daughter is now 6, so I breastfed a really long time ago. But as an Indigenous woman, I had my daughter when I was under the age of 25. Breastfeeding for me has been a really interesting and almost triggering conversational piece. And we're going to get into that today. And also I would like to say trigger warning before we even get into this about any people that are unable to breastfeed for a variety of different reasons. Women may choose to not breastfeed and they may not be able to, or not even just women, people in general that have that as an option might decide not to. That doesn't make anybody less of a mother or a less of a parent or caregiver. Also, people that are in care of small babies themselves that may look at the importance of breastfeeding, or in particular breast milk. We're going to have a little bit of yarn about it. And that's the importance as well. This is not a black and white conversation. This is not a simplistic yarn. There are so many working pieces behind it. So I breastfed my daughter. My mum breastfed me, my nana, or, generations upon generations. So breastfeeding was a very important thing in my family. I feel like for a lot of Indigenous people it is, but for a lot of people as well, it's not something that's tangible, especially in this, contemporary society, but also the role and the responsibility and the effort and the time and the energy into breastfeeding as well. It's often glamorized. It's often viewed as this easy kind of thing to do, but it's not. So I became a mother under the age of 25. So that's categorized as a young or a youth in this country, apparently. So I became a mum at 23, turning 24. And for me, breastfeeding was something that was always shame. I was always shame about it. I never felt comfortable breastfeeding in public. I would never, pull or do what needed to be done, pull a shirt up and feed her in public. I would always look and desperately look for locations to breastfeed in privacy. And that had a really negative impact on me, as I was ashamed to go certain places out of fear and concern that I would not be able to breastfeed her. There wasn't adequate places for privacy, and that was a real impact on my sense of being social, on my sense of connection. So, at things at football games, at the movies, I don't think they have a parents' room there. Definitely don't have parent rooms at the football, let me tell you that much. They don't have parent rooms at places like that. So my main place where I could take my daughter was shopping centres. And it's really interesting and ironic that they have breastfeeding rooms or places, obviously, to provide care, but in particular areas to breastfeed. And that's intertwined with capitalism. It's like, oh, okay, here's a nice safe place for you to feed your child. There is central nutrients, but I'm going to do it in a place where you spend money, or I'm going to do it in a place where what's economically viable. They don't build these spaces to access in places that we frequent, such as parks, such as, football stadiums or areas and things like that. So I always had a lot of anxiety around breastfeeding. I didn't go out. I didn't attend a lot of things. I was very shame and very embarrassed. It was something that was very private, and it's not even the exposure. So it's not even showing your body in a certain way. It's got nothing to do with that. It's this intimate act of feeding my child. It's something that I viewed as very, very sacred. It was very a personal connection, something that I could only give my daughter, and something that was only made for her, this sense of sustenance, but also importantly, this spiritual connection behind it. And at the time, I didn't know that. It was a protection mechanism to protect my child, but also protect myself. And when I talk about shame, I wasn't ashamed of my body. I was not ashamed of the act of feeding my daughter. I was ashamed of the attention around me. Now, if you are tuning in online, or if you're not particularly familiar with what I look like, I hope you're watching this on YouTube so you know what I look like, because I'm looking real cute. I got a pair of earrings on, a bit of lippy. Anyways, look at me. Let me look at me getting everywhere. You know what time it is. Let me get back to the point of the conversation. Anyways, so I knew the attention that I would garner when I would breastfeed in public. We know it's a fetish, okay? So we know men are into this. This is a real thing, and we're not going to talk about fetishes. If you want me to do an episode dedicated to talking about fetishes, comment it down below, or if you're too shame, inbox me. So that's but that's a working element, right? So it's a fetish. If you don't know what I look like, I am a 6-foot Aboriginal woman. I am a big woman. If I walk into a space, you are going to recognize me. I'm also plus size. I, walk into a place and people will just automatically look at me. I do not look like your average Joe. Let's put it that way. So if I'm walking around, or if I'm sitting in a place with a baby, or I'm trying to breastfeed, that lens is already on me. Now, this is another important element, is the notion of race. And this is something I wanted to talk about. And I feel like largely in the women's movement or the feminist movement, race is so overlooked. Race is so disregarded, and race is so marginalized. And I think that's to the convenience of the white women that are chairing and leading these conversations. You don't get to educate me on motherhood. You don't get to educate me on breastfeeding. You don't get to talk to me about A, B, C, or D, because the racial discrimination and marginalization that I have endured in this country, let alone my mother, my grandmother, and all the women before me, it contributes to a culmination of marginalization and alienation in this country. But also the lens of being an other, the lens of being fetishized, the lens of being hypersexualized as an Aboriginal woman in this country. And if you don't know what I'm talking about when I talk about hypersexualization of Aboriginal women, all you need to do is have a look at the history books. The proof and the evidence is there. Now, these horrific historical values of Aboriginal women, and I'm not saying, let me be clear here, anybody, any gender, any sexual orientation can breastfeed. I'm talking from the perspective of myself, and it's really important that you recognize that breastfeeding is not assigned to one gender. Breastfeeding is an experience. Breastfeeding is a relational experience. So keep that in mind. But I will not overlook the relationship between motherhood and Aboriginal women in this country, and I will not overlook breastfeeding and Aboriginal women in this country as well. Now, I am a plus size woman as well, so I'm also a bigger woman. I'm a voluptuous woman. So breastfeeding for somebody like me is a different experience for someone that is petite as well. I'd like to talk about that. Having a bigger body in spaces like this, you're not able to be as discreet. You're not able to simply put a blanket over it and do what you need to do. And I think that's another really important element here, is exploring bodies, and particularly fat bodies, and the ways that we're viewed in society, the ways that we're seen as disgusting and vile in society, simply for our size. So as you can see, these kind of two working parts in my identity, my race and the fact that I'm fat, really shaped my experience as a mother and had a negative impact on my breastfeeding experience. I don't have photos breastfeeding my daughter. I don't have videos of her and I together. There's nothing. There's not an image. I tried to look around. I thought, did my sister even take any photos? There's absolutely nothing. Now, I want to talk about this from it kind of being a very personal and sacred thing. Like for me, and a lot of the women in my family, we don't breastfeed in front of men. We wouldn't expose ourselves in that way in front of men or publicly as well. And that is another element. And I'm not speaking for all Aboriginal, but for a lot of Aboriginal people, that is a very sacred and woman's business thing to do. So there's that element as well that I wouldn't want someone taking photos of me, in public. Of me in these intimate moments is what I'm trying to say with my daughter. I don't know how I'd even feel about my sister taking photos of me. I don't even know how I would have felt at the time about myself taking photos. Breastfeeding my child, such a beautiful and sacred moment, but also the sense of not taking photos of them because I was embarrassed. Not taking photos because if I'm embarrassed in society, if I'm embarrassed to do this in public in shame because everybody wants to watch me, how is that translating to my home? And I'm jumping across a lot of different conversations because that's what runs through your mind when you're partaking on an experience and you already know that you're living in a colonized society, a society that views you as absolute filth because you're Aboriginal and because you're fat and undesirable. That leaves you feeling really vulnerable. And the sense of being exposed doing such a vulnerable act as feeding my daughter was one I did not feel comfortable to be on film. Now, as I've grown and matured and I've become more aware and more informed on my rights as an Indigenous woman, if I was to become a mother again, you best believe I would take photos. Would they be posted? Probably not. But would I keep them for my child and myself to look back on, remember? Hell yes, I would, because I don't have not one to look back on in regards to my daughter now. So what I wanted to talk about is the importance of the week. So recognizing obviously the benefits of breastfeeding. This isn't like a public health podcast. I'm not going to sit here and tell you all the benefits of breastfeeding. Give it a Google. There's plenty of other people having these conversations. What I want to talk about is white feminists and taking up space. You cannot encourage people or collectives to encourage them to breastfeed if you don't know their cultural backgrounds. You cannot encourage or tell people to breastfeed if you don't know what it's like for them currently in society, let alone historically. Now, these speaking points don't just pertain to Aboriginal people. Looking at the experiences of colonization, looking at hypersexualization, looking at an experience of religion or culture, these are integral conversations that this country has to start having. And if you are a feminist and you are white and you're feeling a bit triggered from this conversation, you should be. Because if we're not looking at the racial and the experiences of minorities in this country in regards to promoting and encouraging women to breastfeed, that's a problem. And I'd also like to talk about, is it even feasible? Is it even feasible to encourage people or women or people in low socioeconomic backgrounds or people that belong to marginalized collectives? Is it even viable to encourage them to breastfeed? Are there adequate spaces? Are they safe to do so? What are the conversations happening within their circles? And if feminism or any movement does not have the capacity to involve those types of conversations and reflect and engage with people that belong to those discourses, it's not feminism at all. It's a form of white supremacy. And I've had enough of that. And what happens in these spaces of feminism and breastfeeding and talking about motherhood and, the husband and the mortgage and the 2.5 children and the dog and the fucking corgi and the white picket fence, you're pushing and promoting assimilationist ideals. We don't want to assimilate. I don't want that white collar life that we've been prescribed to. And funnily enough, so many people are. Even white women, so many people are sick and tired of prescribing to these ideals that have been created by white men to benefit white societies. We have our own ideals, we have our own beliefs, and most importantly, we have our own experiences in contemporary society. And I think anyone listening to this, I want you to use this as an opportunity to really reinvest in what it means to be being able to breastfeed in a country like Australia. What does that embody? What would someone else's experience, how would it differ from your own? Because that's where the real allyship begins. That's where the real hard work begins, is when you start to reimagine your own experience through the lens of somebody else. And I'm so passionate about dissolving these core beliefs about motherhood and how integral breastfeeding is, or how great it is to, make your own baby its own organic food, and all these wonderful things that are being pushed behind these, largely white spaces. Can people afford to make their babies their own food? Do people have access to those materials to be able to do that? I mean, I know you can boil an apple in a pot, but I'm talking about these more complex canning and that, and the other, and I dry freeze, do we have capacity to do that? Or is that intertwined to capitalism? And most of the time it is. And that's where it's recognizing privilege. And I wish I could go back in time. I wish I could go back in time to AJ and tell her, you have every right to breastfeed in public. That just like every other woman in this country, you have the right to breastfeed in public. If your child is crying and she needs sustenance or she needs milk, just like air to babies, you have every single right to do that in public. And people in our society should have the responsibility and the diligence to make women like myself feel comfortable. But we know that's not the case. Now, also from a perspective piece, I would like to talk about if fat people in this country can't even go into certain clothing stores and buy clothes. So I have, and you may think, oh my God, AJ, you're being such a capitalist comparing breastfeeding to clothing. No, I'm not. I'm drawing correlations between what it's like. If I can't go and buy clothes at a certain store, if I can't, sit in certain movie theaters because I don't fit, or if I can't sit in certain chairs in restaurants and be a part of a meal in a society, why am I as a fat person going to feel comfortable enough to breastfeed in public? Something so intimate and sacred. So we need to really start exploring the paradigms again of bigger bodies and fatter bodies and a race and gender as well. Looking at people that are, have from the queer experience or have gender fluidity. What is their experience like? Where are their voices? And again, other religions, other cultures, what's it like? How can we support them to feel comfortable enough to breastfeed in public? And is that even feasible? Because not everybody lives in Batesman Bay or in Coogee or, on the nice side of Brisbane, where people respect them and value them because of the way they look or how much money they have in their bank. Not all of us are attributed that privilege. So on this week, I want to use it like I do with most of my content to plant seeds. I want to encourage you to reflect and explore realities of different people. This week should move beyond exploring what the benefits are for breastfeeding. We know what there is. There's lots of evidence. And if not, if you don't know a lot of the evidence, I encourage you to have a good look or a good research. But importantly, let's start exploring the paradigms around it. And let's start exploring feminism in this country and if it's in fact benefiting all women or if it's just benefiting one demographic. Also, what I wanted to talk about in regards to breastfeeding in our society, we also have to explore other factors that impact all of us. And one of these factors that impact us is the pressure to return to work, the pressure to look or be a certain way. Breastfeeding, I breastfed for a year. It is not easy. It's absolutely draining. I remember feeling like, I use the analogy to my mum, I feel like she's sucking the energy out of me. I literally felt like my daughter was sucking and taking so much from me. And I think, again, that really intertwines to the spiritual experience. And as an Aboriginal woman, the sense that I had of the connection I shared with my daughter, giving my daughter something that was made from her, from my body, but also importantly, the energy that's in it. That sense of sacredness. And continuing with a practice that our ancestors practiced on this continent for over 80,000 years. So breastfeeding for us in Australia, like other Indigenous collectives around the world, it has a different experience, and that experience should be respected. It shouldn't be overlooked because, again, that's contributing to assimilation. If you are ignoring the fact that Aboriginal women have been breastfeeding on the continent of Australia for over 80,000 years in your work or your discourse or your core beliefs, you're a part of the problem. Now, I wanted to create another podcast talking about all this new age stuff. That's going to be for another day. Again, let me know in the comments if you want me to create a video about that. But today, exclusively, we're talking about the role of feminism, the erasure of Indigenous experiences and experiences of other people of colour, the erasure of low socioeconomic, and the erasure of bodies and flesh, bodies and identities that don't fit within the accepted paradigms within Australia, and paradigms that largely support white people. Now, another thing I wanted to talk about as well is understanding the relationship and the experience of women in contemporary society now with breastfeeding. And as I mentioned, that demand to return to work, the demand to, spread ourselves so thinly. And even in regards to raising and providing care to children, there's still little discourse around capacity to do that. Stress and milk production, even your diet, if you don't eat enough, you're not able to make enough milk. All of these intricacies that, again, in this kind of feminism of women and that is largely led by white women in this country, ignores. Because if I had a nice, fat, juicy bank account, maybe I wouldn't be worrying about going back to work as soon as I was. Or maybe I wouldn't be sitting at home stressing about being able to make rent. So that would impact my milk supply, because that's exactly what was happening to me. My economic status was literally impacting my capacity to produce milk for my child because I was stressed. I was stressed out. I was dirt poor. And these experiences are integral in these discourses in this country. When you are looking to re-educate, when you are looking to re-inform, if you are not involving a myriad of voices, you are pushing one ideal, and one ideal that fits the privileged collective. And that has occurred for far too long in this country. So this International Breastfeeding Week, I want you to think about Indigenous collectives. I want you to think about people of colour. I want you to think about the experiences from your own ancestors. What were the experiences of women in places like England when they were breastfeeding and they had to have wet nurses because it wasn't appropriate for them to breastfeed? They were higher in society, or the poor people within, these countries, historically, white Western societies. What was it like for them? We really need to start having these conversations in this country, and we need to start looking at the experiences of our ancestors to find empowerment, but importantly, to find recognition of the experiences of the people that have come before us. Because a lot of those answers, there is so much to be taught from Indigenous perspectives in regards to breastfeeding, in regards to children, in regards to family and community. But if we continue to push these ideals, as radicalized as they are, if they don't recognize us, they're never going to be for us. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the podcast. As you can imagine, this is a much larger conversational piece, but I wanted to nonetheless come together and plant these seeds and encourage you all to start having a critical lens, and importantly, think about your experience in order to shed lights or learn about the experience of others. Thank you so much, and be sure to tune in for our next episode coming hot and ready. Leave a comment, leave a share, let me know you enjoyed it, and I'll be bringing episode 3 to you before you know it. Thank you. Love you, fellas. Bye. Hello, my beautiful people. And at the end of this episode, I wanted to let you all know an exciting opportunity that I'm launching. I will be kicking off my 4-week workshop, Midnight Mothers, on the 29th of August. If this podcast episode has moved you or inspired you to again invest in re-educating yourself in regards to experiences of childbirth and child raising in this country, that so-called Australia, this workshop will be for you. We are using an Indigenous lens to explore the privatisation of the birthing industry. We're also looking at traditional practices and the ways that capitalism has shaped what it means to give birth, and importantly, your care during this time in your life. I'm really excited and again honored to kick off this workshop. We'll also be having a series of guests attend to share their information. Each week we will have a different topic, a different area of exploration, which will include a series of digital resources, including exclusive video content that I have created. Everything was curated and created by me. And if you enjoy my content online, this workshop is for you. If you would like any more information, please feel free to hit me up. Midnight Mothers, coming the 29th of August. I can't wait to see you there.